Let's get this video in. It's actually 5 in the morning, but this is going to count as a Sunday video. I'm going to try to do my videos Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. I was trying to do videos every day for this and for my Patreon support group. It's too much. So the support group will be Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Readings will be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, so I can get more of the books out. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. I think I'm going to try to, maybe I'll do Malcolm X. Maybe I'll do Malcolm X and the FBI Files. That's a good one. A lot of people don't have that one. All right, let's get into this. Regulating the Poor. I'm reading a chapter on cities. And this section is local responses to disorder. Considering the migration brought blacks into urban electoral politics in large numbers, the initial unresponsiveness of local government is remarkable. Low rates of registration among blacks notwithstanding, in the areas from which they migrated, blacks were generally disenfranchised in the cities. They became at least nominal participants in electoral politics. By 1960, at least 1 in 5 residents in our 50 largest cities was a black. Some of these cities had few blacks. El Paso, example, had fewer than 10,000, but others such as Newark, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia were well on their way toward black majorities. But despite their growing votes, urban blacks got little from the urban political apparatus. Not jobs, nor housing, nor health care, nor even much by the way of relief payments. Indeed, it can be said that in some respects, the circumstances of urban blacks worsened precisely because their numbers increased. As the central city ghetto, swollen by thousands of newcomers as well as by a high birth rate, began to spill over into white neighborhoods, schools, parks, and hospitals, bitter resistance was generated among the older inhabitants of the city. The trouble was often publicly attributed to blighted housing of inferior schools, but its main source was white resentment of black incursions. Even the fiscal troubles of the city, while real enough, aroused intense political ire because rising costs were associated with the influx of the black poor. That these feelings were so bitter was partly a result of changes in the style and method of urban politics. In the era of the political machine, a degree of consensus could be maintained by converting public goods into private favors to be divided among competing groups. But one group ordinarily did not directly, or at least not obviously, infringe on the interests of other groups. But with the growth of bureaucratically organized municipal services, whether in education, housing, law enforcement, or urban renewal, the policies controlling the allocation of these services became the grist of urban politics. Unlike private favors, public service concessions cannot easily be divvied up. If schools or housing are provided for one group, it is usually at the expense of another, and it is usually obvious that this is the case. And so the allocation of municipal services among competing groups emerged as the chief focus of political conflict. Confronted by seemingly irreconcilable group demands regarding allocation and control of municipal services, mayors generally favored the various white blocs with which they were aligned, ignoring their new black constituents. New public housing, for example, was reduced to a trickle despite the availability of federal funds because the projects generated fierce opposition from whites who feared the invasion of the black poor. Other federal programs, such as urban renewal, were turned against blacks. Renewal projects were undertaken in most big cities to deal with the black invasion through slum clearance. Boy, I tell you, things don't change. By reclaiming land taken by the expanding ghettos and restoring it to higher economic uses, i.e., the uses that would keep better off whites and businesses in the central city, 70% of the families thus uprooted were black. But the blacks becoming more disorderly and more demanding in the early 1960s, local government began to make some concessions. Urban renewal provides one example. By the early 1960s, black protests were mounting against Negro removal in the guise of slum clearance, and political leaders in some cities with large black populations became apprehensive. They did not halt the demolition of black neighborhoods, however, for that would have displeased the commercial and civic interests that benefited from urban renewal. Instead, to conciliate blacks while still pushing forward with renewal projects, local officials began to implement new federal guidelines which required that relocation services and subsidies be provided to those who would have to be removed from the neighborhoods designated for clearance. In other words, although black votes and protests did not yet have sufficient force to prevent the destruction of their homes and the usurpation of their neighborhoods, they at least produced modest services and financial aid for some of those who were driven out. We were in the projects in Prospect Place in Brooklyn, and they told us it was structurally unsound and moved us all out, knocked it all down and built something else, quote unquote affordable housing. Now, none of the people who lived there I don't know where they are. We're scattered all to the wind. I was sleeping on a train, I'm pretty sure. I'm not the only one from the projects. When those projects get knocked down and they tell you you're going to have first dibs to move back in, you're not going to be able to afford it. Plus, you're going to have to go into a private housing at market rates, which means you're probably not going to make it to the time that building's being built. And a lot of people move down south, and if you're from New York and you move down south, it can be rough. Even if you have family, it could be rough. What they did begin to get was more relief benefits. More people began to apply for relief, and more of those who applied were admitted to the rolls. And in all likelihood, this happened because it was easier to give relief than to grant other concessions. The rising rolls were objectionable to whites, to be sure, but considerably less so than locating public housing projects in white neighborhoods, or integrating schools, or enforcing fair employment statute. Urban politicians, in other words, permitted modest concessions and relief giving as a means of placating the discontented. Like they'll give us housing vouchers to move to different neighborhoods, overpay for slummy apartments, subpar apartments, instead of just building projects. They're doing that right now. I'm living proof. And so the urban welfare rolls began to rise during the early 1960s, especially in the North. The 78 northern urban counties where the welfare rolls had risen by only 41% in the early decade experienced increases of 53% in the next 4 years alone. In many places, the rises were quite substantial. The rolls in Baltimore, for example, rose 128%, in Hartford 120%, in Newark 98%, in Cleveland 96%, in Kansas City, Kansas 80%. Some southern cities also began to respond. Civil rights agitation in the South reached a crescendo during this period. Local whites repaid sit-ins, demonstrations, and boycotts with killings, jailings, burnings, and bombings. At the same time, and partly as a result of voter registration campaigns by civil rights activists, blacks were beginning to emerge as a modest electoral force in the South. Even before the congressional enactment of voting rights legislation in 1964 and 1965, voter registration had risen sharply by 800,000 between 1962 and 1964. And this electorate was being alerted and activated by civil rights turmoil. Therefore, even as they publicly condoned repression of civil rights demonstrators, some Southern officials permitted a modest liberalization of relief policies during 1960 to 1964, while the rolls in the South as a whole rose by only 7%. The rolls in 43 urban counties showed an increase of 24%. In some cities, the rises were large enough to more or less offset steep declines that had occurred during the 1950s. In New Orleans, the rolls had fallen by 48% in the 1950s, but they rose by 35% between 1960 and 1964. In Atlanta, the rolls declined by 30% in the 1950s, but rose by 19% in the early 1960s. In Savannah, the rolls dropped by 40% in the 1950s and then rose by 50% in just 4 years. In the light of the deepening distress of black poor in the South, however, these rises were modest. And we're going to leave it there. How much time we got? And let's finish this chapter out. None of this should be taken to mean that welfare restrictions gave way in the early 1960s. As before, many families that applied for aid were turned down. Indeed, the rising tide of black migrants and of white hostility toward them led some jurisdictions to begin enacting new restrictions. In 1962, for example, New York State passed a Welfare Abuses Act, a special type of residency law under which a person can be denied benefits if it can be shown that he came into the state for the express purpose of obtaining them. Although the New York law placed the burden of proof regarding motive of the local welfare department, the mere fact that an applicant came from out of state was often used as a prima facie. I know how to say this word, but I just forgot to pronounce it. A prima facie evidence that he had migrated for the purpose of collecting welfare. Consequently, many thousands of families were disqualified and given bus tickets back to their states of origin. They do that too. The homeless organizations will give you a bus ticket out. Despite a number of such efforts to impose new restrictions, however, a general pattern of liberalization did not begin across the country. In the nation's 121 urban counties, this should be counties. The rolls rose 47% in the 4 years compared to a rise of only 35% during the entire preceding decade. In the relief rise in the early 1960s, if the relief rising in the early 1960s coincided with the rise of disorder, this relationship was even more striking after 1964, as protests, demonstrations, riots, and other forms of disorder reached unprecedented heights between 1965 and 1968. The relief rolls climbed 58%, having already risen 31% in the preceding 4 years. 121 urban counties showed an increase of 80% after 1964. In the big 5 urban counties, the rolls more than doubled, up 105%. And in the South, the first significant rise in 15 years as an increase of 43% took place after 1964. At first glance, these data might suggest that a simple and direct relationship between growing black turbulence on the one hand and greater responsiveness by local government on the other. However, local government was also under pressure to conciliate blacks from quite another source during the 1960s, namely the federal government. even as many urban political leaders continued to fight a rearguard action against blacks on behalf of their white constituents. National political leaders were developing programs that represented concessions to blacks. The main significance of these new programs, especially the anti poverty program, which was initiated in 1964, is that they led to reform in the practices of local government. In other words, under prodding from the federal government, local government was made to revise some of its service policies so as to give more to blacks. Thus, as we shall presently see, it was the federal programs that washed away one local relief restriction after another, especially after 1964. To understand why the national government intervened in local service arrangements, it is necessary to examine the impact of both growing bloc of black voters and rising black disorder on national political assignments. It seems like all they understand is when we're disorderly and chaotic and tear things up. And it's kind of sad because you can see it coming. But the thing is, I'm not sure it's going to be us. I think it's going to be immigrants. It's probably going to be, we have a lot of Indian immigrants, a lot of Spanish speaking immigrants here. Some of them are not the asylum seekers. They've been here for a while or their parents came here. I just think it's going to be, it's a lot of heat, a lot of anger. And I think they're being pushed to the brink. And I think that everyone's going to be on the street. It's going to be chaos. And we already know from January 6th that poor whites are not happy. So I think it's going to be, for the first time in a long time in this society, an actual unification of chaos. And cities are going to burn. I think city halls are going to be under siege. I think governor's mansions are going to be under siege. I think you might even see legislators replaced on local level in smaller cities and towns by militia. I wouldn't be surprised to see that. Until next time, support the channel, hit the links. And I hope you enjoy these readings. I certainly enjoy them. Sometimes I butcher names and mispronounce. Sometimes it's because I'm sleepy. Sometimes it's just I'm reading so much and writing so much. So forgive me. Until next time, please take care of yourselves and be safe.